Welcome, everybody, to the Third and Goal podcast. I'm Tyler James, and I'm joined, as always, by the one and only Eric Hansen. Together, we cover Notre Dame football, recruiting, and more for blueandgold.com on the On3 network. We are inching closer to spring football at Notre Dame, which means we've been getting a chance to meet Notre Dame's new assistant coaches, the mid-year transfers, and early enrolled freshmen. The NFL scouting combine is underway in Indianapolis, and there's plenty of conversation going on about the future of college football at the national level all the way to Washington, D.C. That means right now is sort of the perfect time, and any time would be a perfect time to speak with On3 national college football insider Pete Nakos, who has his finger on the pulse of all the major storylines in the sport. Pete, thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me on, guys. Happy to be here.
Pete, if you don't mind, before we get into some of the college football topics, I wanted to start maybe on more of a personal note. I think it's been fascinating to see the way you've climbed onto the national scene with On3 in these last few years. How have you been able to establish yourself as sort of a national reporting authority so quickly?
I appreciate that. I moved to Nashville, I think 20 months ago now, and it's kind of been a lot of that since then, and just super grateful for all the resources and what Shannon Terry's done to support me, and Luke Stampini and Jack Terry have been a huge part of that. I don't really know how it's happened, guys. I tell you that if the transfer portal and NIL didn't exist, I'd probably be a beat writer somewhere right now, trying to climb up the ladder and covering a team, but just super grateful for all the opportunities. And it's listen, college football is the fastest growing sport right now, I think, in the country, and it's probably the biggest challenger to the NFL, and it's going to change a lot, I'm sure, over the rest of my lifetime and how the game changes. But I think more than ever, it needs more and more day-to-day coverage, and that's what we're doing here.
That was very good. Do you have an NIL deal yourself?
Just with On3. No, just make sure to wear On3 gear into the office every day. I think that's.
I'm angling for one with Keurig, but I wanted to start with a story you did real recently that just fascinated me, and that was the prospect of maybe there being, and it's probably not maybe, it probably is going to be blind transfers in the springtime. Since there was just one transfer portal window, we know that there's going to be injuries and other things happen in the spring. Can you define for our listeners what a blind transfer looks like to you, and how big of an issue is this?
Yeah, so it's kind of like a term per se that's really kind of taken hold, I guess in the last 18 months, not probably like 12 months now. And the thought is a blind transfer is an athlete who unenrolls from an institution and then enrolls at a new institution, and they won't be on scholarship. They'll arrive as a walk-on. But in this day and age, guys, this NIL dollars can make up if they're not actually placed on scholarship. The most high-profile case of this, you have Xavier Lucas, the standout cornerback with Wisconsin in 2024. He signs a deal to return to Wisconsin in 25, or at least that's what Wisconsin argues. They don't put him in the transfer portal, and he ultimately makes the decision to unenroll from classes at in Madison and enrolls at Miami. And then he's a part of the national title team this year that went to the national title for the Hurricanes. And we can dive into all the ins and outs of it, but the biggest headliner here is there's only one college football transfer portal this year, right? It was 15 days in January. It feels like that was like 3 years ago now. But there's a lot of moving pieces in spring ball. You factor in injuries and quarterback competitions, and there's going to be situations where players feel like they're not going to either have the opportunity to play, or programs are going to be looking to fill some holes, and it could lead to some situations where we could see some more player movement.
Let me follow up on that real quick, because Notre Dame fans will say, wait a second, this sounds familiar. Now, this happened during the January portal period this year, but Spencer Porath was a kicker at Purdue. He never entered the portal. We interviewed him the other day. He was a lot of gray area with his interview. But is this an example of a blind transfer, or because it happened during the portal period, it isn't technically?
If he didn't go in and he enrolled at a new institution, in this case Notre Dame, that's a blind transfer. Yep.
Okay.
I guess what's your sense for what the recourse will be for if this happens? Is there anything that the colleges or the NCAA can do to prevent something like this from happening?
Yeah, it's interesting, right? So it's something that's definitely starting to really take hold in the last like 6 weeks. People talking about it. I've gotten like a phone call a day about it. It feels like the NCAA introduced some proposals this week that won't be voted on until April, where a coach who accepts a transfer outside of when the transfer portal is open, or if an athlete enters the portal during that transfer portal window, could be looking at like a 6 months, not 6 months, suspension through the sixth game of the season. We're talking about like 7-figure fines here, 20% of a budget being fined against the school if they bring in a transfer. To me, from talking to some people, those seemed like some very drastic proposals and some penalties that, would really, if a school brought in a transfer outside of the portal windows and then the NCAA tried to levy those sanctions against the coach, I think we'd be talking about a lot of lawsuits. So do the proposals shift in the next 6 weeks? I'm not sure. I get the feeling that they might, but those are supposed to be voted on in April, and they would theoretically put some sort of penalties into place for when spring semester ends across the country.
And then Pete, so I would assume most contracts for kids, 1-year contracts, go January to January. So if they're doing this in spring, we're talking about buyouts. How messy do the buyouts get? Are they uniform across, are these contracts pretty boilerplate, or some places it'd be easy to get out of it, some places really difficult?
Yeah, so a lot of these contracts are boilerplate at this point. Here's what I tell you is that everyone's going to have a buyout. Some schools will say, though, and I got this from some GMs when I talked to them, and they're like, if a player really wants to leave, right, if they have made this decision and their agent that they're going to leave, the school could really give a crap if they leave or not, as long as they get paid their money. That's all they care about. And for some people, that'll be enough, right? Like that's the other thing that I guess we'll see how it shapes over the next 6 weeks is, does the NCAA come to the conclusion that if an athlete wants to leave, as long as they pay out their the buyout that's set, does the NCAA care? I don't know the answer to that, but from talking to some schools, as long as they get their money, that might be the only thing they care about if the athlete doesn't want to be at that school.
Pete, you mentioned NIL, and that's been a big part of how you've ascended in your job. You had a story recently that quoted one Power 4 general manager saying that we're going to have multiple rosters over $40 million in college football this season. I'm curious, what is your perspective on where Notre Dame fits in the NIL landscape?
Listen, Notre Dame's interesting, and I say that because Marcus Freeman and the administration around him have really been adamant about they're not going to flaunt money, right? That's like not how Notre Dame does their business. They never have. They're not going to be the flashy school in NIL, but behind closed doors, you consistently hear that Notre Dame is funded at the top of the sport next to everyone else. So I don't know if they're at the $40 million mark from the GMs I've spoken to and stuff. I'd say that they're not probably. But man, they were aggressive in the portal. They brought in 2 Ohio State wide receivers that you guys are going to talk a lot about this summer and how they could raise expectations for this program. And I mean, they spent what they needed to address the areas of concern after the season. So I'd say they're probably, everyone's always like, are they in the first tier or the second tier and things like that? Like, how many schools are we putting in that first tier then? I would tell you that they're definitely in the top echelon of spending in college football. I'd say that they probably don't have like a top 4 to 5 spending roster right now, though, in the sport.
So, Pete, there's a lot of people that follow college football don't follow it into the weeds like we do when it comes to the economics of it. So they look at it and they go, well, there's this rev share thing that there's supposed to be a cap, and then there's NIL. How does this all work together? And is the NIL money legit? Do we think it's going through the clearinghouse? Do we think that this is legit NIL and not just pay for play?
Yeah, so we got so used to the last 4 years, it was only NIL, right? You had NIL collectives. That's how payrolls were doled out. That's how teams were constructed. Nowadays with revenue sharing, you have about 15 to 18 million from the school going to, acquiring the roster. But then from there, you still have NIL, third-party payments going to athletes. But it gets a little more trickier now because you have the College Sports Commission and they have a clearinghouse that all those third-party deals have to go through. So the contracts go under, a little bit more inspection, things like that. But everything to this rate, the CSC has definitely opened up some investigations into some deals and some schools situations, but none of it has really centered that much around football. And a lot of it has gone away very quickly whenever they have questions. So there hasn't been too many hitches when it comes to paying athletes through third-party NIL deals. At the same time, though, I think there's also a factor here of we haven't seen any lawsuits filed yet. And I think the reason why we haven't seen any lawsuits filed is most of these deals have still gone through. So until we really get a situation where a top quarterback, for example, isn't paid the money he's expecting to be, paid for his services, because a contract doesn't go through the clearinghouse, I don't think we're really going to see a boiling point or anything like that.
Pete, I'm curious, as you go through the process of reporting NIL deals and amounts that are associated with them, this isn't necessarily new. We see this with NFL contracts. Sometimes the numbers that get shared are maybe a little more inflated than the reality of what it is. What is the challenge of sort of getting to the truth of behind some of these NIL numbers that get floated around? Yeah,
we made the decision a couple of years ago of, okay, college football is only going to become more professionalized and college basketball is coming with it too. And the deal figures are only going to become more and more official. You're going to start seeing it more too with revenue sharing. And if we ever get to collective bargaining, how can we, be first in reporting this? And we made the decision that if we can come out and, factually report on the range of deals and things of that sort, then we're going to do it. Now, obviously, not everyone's willing to show us a contract. So in situations like that, you got to have at least 3 or 4 sources. I'm not going to just run something off one source. And beyond that too, I think we've done a really good job of just trying to give people a good idea of what the we're not going to say 5 to 10 million because that's such a massive gap. But if we can get it down to 5 to 6 million and put it in that range, and readers and fans can have an understanding of how much an athlete's being paid, then we'll do that.
The other issue with all this that has come up recently is the NCAA talking about bringing their claws back when it comes to tampering. That seems like an incredible undertaking. I'm really curious if you think they have the manpower to take that on, and do you think that they can define tampering enough where you can have something to enforce, because there seems like there's so many loopholes with it?
Yeah, so the most interesting thing about tampering is it happens every day. It's not just like a 2 months out of the year thing. It's constantly happening in all the major sports, football and basketball, and it happens in other sports as well. The other thing that you really need to do when you're trying to enforce tampering and you're the NCAA is you need people to confess. You need documents proving that there's been tampering. You need a school to go on the record and say that our athlete told us that these 3 schools reached out to us. You need a lot of evidence to prove of tampering. And obviously what Dabo Swinney did in pointing out that, bringing evidence to the table that Ole Miss reached out to a tight end, that they had Luke Farrelly, and he obviously goes to Ole Miss and things like that. That has definitely been the most public situation we've had. Now we'll see how the NCAA decides to enforce that and things like that. But I'll tell you that there's a lot of people right now across college football who kind of have this mindset of we're not going to hold our breath. We're not going to, it's kind of wait and see almost. But at the same time, it's we're not going to stop from doing what we're doing because we have to do it to win. So if we're not going to change that mindset, we'll see if the NCAA decides to catch up or not.
Pete, when we add all these things together, the rising cost of doing business, the tampering, the blind transfers, is this model sustainable?
I get asked that question a lot, Eric, and I try not to answer because I'm not a lawyer and I'm not an athletic director and I'm not a conference commissioner. And I love football and I love college football, and I don't want to be the one to be yeah, it's going to die. I just tell you that I think we're going down an interesting path where there's going to only be more change. I wonder a lot if fans like it or hate it. I love covering the transfer portal. It's a lot of fun. I sleep only 4 hours a night and things like that. And It's a lot of fun to cover, but at the same time, like, how much do fans like? There's got to be a little bit of, exhaustion too. So, how's it all shake out? This doesn't feel like the final product of college football, right? It feels like it's changing every day. So, how does it get to that final product, and how quickly does it get to that, final destination?
Yeah, the fan perspective is interesting because Notre Dame fans, some will complain about it, and then the first days of the transfer portal, they wanted to start an uprising because Notre Dame didn't have any transfer portal commitments. So they were obviously caring about it then, and obviously Notre Dame came through with commitments towards later on in the transfer portal. But it was interesting to watch the anticipation for its build and obvious a thirst for any sort of information that we could provide on that.
Yeah, no, for sure. It's and then you have these conference commissioners and Notre Dame athletic director Pete Nakos, and is there going to be collective bargaining? Right? Are they going to agree to? Are they going to bargain and agree on some sort of deal that keeps schools and athletes in check? Are athletes going to become employees? That's something that conference commissioners have constantly asked Congress to step in and make sure that athletes can't be employees, but that's yet to happen. So there's a lot of those are kind of like the two routes that I guess we're kind of waiting to see how they unfold.
Well, if you're only sleeping 4 hours a night, you're gonna nudge me out of the NIL deal with Keurig. But
that's only during the portal season.
Okay, all right. Then I'll move on from that.
Yeah, I get my 8 hours of sleep in February.
Well, speaking of the portal season, when you were watching things unfold with Notre Dame, and then ultimately looked at their strategy, did you think it was more of a happy accident, or did you feel like they had a great strategy and you understood it?
I would say
jumping in early.
At the start, I didn't understand the strategy, not because they didn't know what they were doing, but because, it's with so much of the stuff in the portal, it's like, okay, so who are the top players and what do you have to do to go get them? But then the way some things break, like if you told me that they were going to land Mylan Graham and Quincy Porter, I would have been stunned. And not because I would have been like, man, Notre Dame can't do that. No, it would have been because like I didn't think Ohio State would lose both of them. But then for Notre Dame to go out and get them and you guys know Notre Dame football better than I do, but I feel like wide receiver is probably the biggest question mark we all had. For them to go get those guys, it's, there wasn't a lack of strategy, but there is, I know I just said wait and see approach when it comes to tampering, but there's a wait and see approach too in the portal where it's, you don't want to be overly aggressive and spend all your money on the first weekend and all of a sudden like two of the top young wide receivers in the sport hit the portal and you can't afford it. So Notre Dame was smart in that aspect of maybe, preserving some dollars to make sure they could go get what they wanted.
Pete, as teams move forward with sort of adjusting and evolving their own revenue strategies with player acquisition and deciding how much they want to spend on transfer portal and spending on recruiting, do you get a sense of, are we more likely to head down more teams leaning on the portal, more teams going towards recruiting? How do you think this all shakes out, or it will be so varied depending on the school?
Yeah, it's interesting. Notre Dame has only picked up and ramped up in recruiting since Marcus Freeman really took over. Notre Dame's obviously a national brand, but it really seems in high school recruiting right now that they're like truly a national brand. And a lot of credit goes there. I think with your, quote unquote blue bloods, I think you're always going to see a very good mix of 5-star talent coming in and top transfers coming in. And that's what we're seeing at Notre Dame and Ohio State and Georgia. But in the same situation too, it's like for a first-year head coach, you can't just hope that in 3 years you're going to get like a couple 5-stars and it's going to pay off. You got to go win now. And the only way to win now is to go all in on the portal. So I think the formula that we once thought created winning rosters in college football is gone, and it's kind of doing it on the fly. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you have USC that brought in, I want to say 35 high school recruits this year. And I mean, there's a lot of pressure on Lincoln Riley. What's it look like this year? How's it come together? They went all in on high school recruiting, and there's going to be a lot of questions if all the young talent can deliver fast enough for it to matter for Lincoln Riley.
Pete, the last one for me is there's been a lot of stories spread over the last few weeks about the calendar maybe changing, the recruiting calendar, the spring calendar, all kinds of things. I had talked to a couple of sources that have had their feet in both college and the NFL, and they liked the presentation that Nick Saban's talking about, that move the portal till spring, move spring football into summer. Do you think eventually we're going to get to that point where the college calendar mimics the NFL calendar?
Yeah, I don't know. There's a lot of people, specifically in the Big Ten, who wanted the spring portal this year, right? They wanted January to just be about the bowl games and the CFP, and then maybe you have some sort of OTAs in February, but then you would have a spring portal, and then basically like summer camp, and camp starts in like June, and maybe you even go scrimmage someone, and you ramp up for the season, and that mimics the NFL. A lot of people wanted that to happen this year, and that hasn't happened. There's conversations going on behind closed doors, but there's yet to be any officially circulated proposals. My biggest question is not questioning the if it would work or anything. It'd be when's it going to happen so you can put it into action in a time period where it makes sense, right? Because you can't introduce all those things now because you just had the portal and you promised everyone there'd only be one portal window. So that means you probably have to make sure it happens sometime between August, like now and August 30th, if you want it to happen for the 2027 season. And that's not exactly a huge timetable to make massive changes like that. So it kind of goes hand in hand with, is this the final destination for the college football product? No. Once it get there, and do the calendar changes kind of go hand in hand too with, what college football looks like in 5 years?
Pete, last question for me. There was a lot of conversation about whether or not Marcus Freeman would be headed to the NFL this past offseason. Yeah. I'm curious, what do you think moving forward? How serious of a threat is the NFL in terms of taking Marcus Freeman away from Notre Dame?
Listen, early December, that chatter was real. And I was getting like a text or a phone call a day about it, just being from agents, from circles, being like, is this going to happen? It obviously didn't happen. I'll tell you what, Marcus Freeman is probably one of the I can't call him like a top up-and-coming coach anymore. He's like one of the top coaches in the sport. His name's going to continue to come up. And the more and more he has success at Notre Dame, and the more and more that we see that he's a player's coach who can win, I think that his name's going to come up more and more. We didn't see any college football head coaches make the jump from being at college to NFL coach, and that surprised some people just because the NFL coaching carousel pool wasn't as deep as some had thought, and they thought it was going to dip into college, and that didn't happen. So I'm not going to tell anyone that Marcus Freeman's leaving or anything like that. I'm just saying that, his name is going to keep coming up unless he makes it. He's going to. I'll tell you what. I think he's going to have to come out every year and be like, "Yeah, I'm staying Notre Dame." Mm-hmm. They're successful. He's one of the top coaches in the sport. A lot of people want that in the NFL. What he's doing at Notre Dame.
Pete, besides this game-breaking appearance on the Third and Gold podcast, where can people find your content?
You can just find me at on3.com. Make sure to subscribe. We got a new national subscription for $19.99 a year, and then you can go all in on Blue and Gold and hang out with Eric and Tyler.
Awesome.
That sounds great.
We appreciate you joining us, Pete. Have a good one.
You bet. Thanks so much, guys.
Take care.
Why haven't you subscribed to blueandgold.com yet? We have all the Notre Dame intel, analysis, and compelling stories that you could possibly need. New subscribers can give us a try for just $1. Use the link in the video or podcast description, or find the join button at the top of the blueandgold.com homepage. All right, now it's time for questions. You can submit questions to us on Twitter or the Loose Emoji board before every podcast. I'm at TJamesND and Eric's at eHansenND. First one I have for us, Eric, is from at Charles W. Wolf. number one, with 2 stars gone, how deep of a rotation do you think Coach Sider will be utilizing? And number 2, also Valentine's themed question. Eric, do you have a football crush on offense?
Okay, let's split these up. So we'll answer the first one, both of us, and then we'll answer the second one, or
Sure.
I'll answer the second one. So for me, my best guess is it's going to be a game flow thing, but that's going to translate probably to 3 guys playing a lot. I think 4 and 5 are going to get more playing time than 4 and 5 did this past year. For me, it really comes down to what's the gap between 2 and 5, because I don't think there's a big one at this point. Maybe that'll become more apparent through the spring, summer, and fall, because we're throwing Kedron Young in there, and he's not going to be ready to practice in the spring. Again, my sense is it's going to be Aeneas Williams at number 1. I think Kedron Young is going to be in that mix, and then I think there's going to be a wild card, whether it's Nolan James Jr. or one of the 2 freshmen. I think that's the way it's going to go.
It's hard to predict because we just don't know what the development of the number 2 running back is going to look like. Is it going to be someone who can account for all the other things that the number 1 is doing, and there isn't as big of a need for number 3? I think my sense is it's not that Coach Sider is against the idea of playing more than 2 running backs, but if you have 2 running backs that can do everything you need them to do, I don't think that he is going to force a 3rd running back onto the field. So can Kedron Young do everything else if Aeneas Williams is their starter? Is Nolan James Jr. ready? Will one of those freshmen be able to handle what's asked of them going into next season? I think it'll be an interesting conversation going into the season. And I think a lot of us are assuming Aeneas Williams is the number 1. Crazier things have happened if he weren't to end up being that. But I really like his development. I think that he's a very talented running back that can do a lot of good things for Notre Dame. All right, who's your football crush on offense?
Well, it hasn't happened yet because you have to see it in practice. That's what happened with Tay Johnson. There was a day last spring where he was playing safety, but he was lining up in different places, and he was making plays all over the field. And I went, whoa, this dude is fluid. He's athletic. He's versatile. Crush. And we're talking football. We're not talking how good he looks in his uniform. For me, I could guess what might happen. I'm really interested in seeing the 2 wide receivers from Ohio State, Milan Graham and Quincy Porter. I don't know that we're going to see much of Quincy Porter in the spring. I think he's going to be more of a fall camp discovery. And then I've liked Will Black and Matty Augustine. I've been kind of pushing Will Black out there as a potential starter. So it's either going to be those wide receivers or Will Black. But see, sometimes it catches you off guard. I was not expecting Tay Johnson to be as good as he was as early. I thought that was going to be a longer transition, and I'm like, oh no, this is the guy.
If I had to guess, I was going to guess James Flanagan's going to be your spring offense crush.
Well, I do think he's going to be the number 1 tight end. I'm not sure that he's going to be looking like that number 1 tight end until after the summer, but I think he's going to be a guy that falls right in the lineage of these number 1 tight ends, and I think we'll see him play in the NFL someday. How's that?
All right. Our next question is from @WolfND143. Another 2-part question. What are you hearing on the number 2 quarterback? And are there any positive behind-the-scenes information like we heard about Bubba Frazier and his work ethic?
Okay, I'm going to let you answer that first because I'm not sure the Bubba Frazier reference. So.
Yeah, you know what? I was not certain about what that was referencing either. I don't know where that information was coming from. I don't know if someone on Blue and Gold reported. It's not something
right.
that I'd seen. That doesn't mean I don't think Bubba Frazier has a good work ethic, but In terms of, I guess, this time of year specifically, I don't know that I spend a lot of time trying to get inside information when spring is coming up. Like, I feel like so much can change in the spring, and that's what matters most. And what we hear now can change a month from now, 2 months from now, when spring ends and you get through the blue gold game. As for the number 2 quarterback, like Noah Grubbs is certainly going to have a shot to pass up Blake Hebert. That aligns with what we've been hearing. Personally, I'm not writing off Hebert, and I don't think anyone at Notre Dame is necessarily writing him off either. But it's not a coincidence that Notre Dame pushed to bring Teddy Gerard in and increase the competition for the backup quarterback role going into next season. Obviously, we won't get to see Teddy Gerard until the summer. Well, we won't see him in the summer, but Notre Dame won't get him on campus until the summer. So there's plenty of things to unfold as it relates to the number 2 quarterback from now until August.
Yeah, I'd say, and we've talked about this on the podcast before, the kind of the cautionary tale about writing somebody off after their spring performance and kind of their early performances to Deshaun Kaiser.
Right.
Because Kaiser had a killer summer, and then when Malik Zaire went down, he was ready to step in, and there were whispers that he was pushing Zaire in practice. I wasn't necessarily believing them based on what we had seen in the spring. And even Kaiser, I mean, he questioned whether he was even playing the right sport.
Yeah.
If he should have been playing baseball. Here's kind of how I look at this group. I think Blake Hebert is the best athlete at quarterback.
Mm-hmm.
I think Grubbs will end up at the end of spring being the better of those two in terms of playing the position. I just think he processes things better at the line of scrimmage. I think that's kind of the buzz that you're hearing about Grubbs and just his track record in high school of lifting a team that lost so much and didn't have a lot of Division I talent around him, or apparent Division I talent, to a state championship in Florida's biggest class. That was pretty impressive. And then I think just what I've heard about people that have scouted Gerard and watched Teddy Gerard. Now, he's not going to be here in the spring, but the thought about Teddy Gerard, and Tyler, you saw him in a camp and you were impressed by him, is he's really, really advanced in terms of understanding the game. And he's a really good athlete on top of that. Plus, he's 18 years old. As an early, as a guy that reclassified, some people would be 17 that gave up there. He's 18. He turned 18 in January. So it's not like, I think that year is a big difference, that he's going to be closer to 19 when the season starts than he is 18. And I think that's why I feel good about Gerard. But again, that's what's fun about covering football. Things don't always go how you expect. And so Blake Hebert could surprise everybody.
Yeah, our job would be a lot less interesting if everything unfolded as it was expected to. Next question is from @Charles W. Wolf. Do you think it's likely we'll have a clear idea of the starting 5 O-linemen coming out of spring, or do you think spring will be about tinkering and experimenting with different combinations up front?
I do not think we will know the starting 5 coming out of spring. I don't know that we've ever known it, with Joe Rudolph being the coach for different reasons. I think once Charles Jagaza's timeline is clear about his recovery, then everything will be a little bit clearer around him. I also think one thing that's going to kind of cloud things and won't clear up till maybe the fall is if there's a competition at guard between Absher, Will Black, and let's throw Chris Tarrick in there. I think you owe it to those guys to let that play out for a longer term than just say, this is our guy, this is Will Black's it, and we're going forward with him.
Yeah, and even if I know everyone, a lot of Notre Dame fans want to see Anthony Knapp move inside, so one of the 5-star tackles can be a left tackle. If that is going to happen, I would imagine Anthony Knapp will get spring reps at guard. So I think there will probably be plenty of opportunities for using different combinations. That they have the advantage of, they do have a lot of experience returning, right? They did lose 2 starters but they had guys that have played, and so they're someone's probably going to start that maybe didn't start last year, but there's a chance that it's not a big change. So I think there's more flexibility. And listen, that's never stopped Joe Rudolph in his time at Notre Dame. He's done things that we wouldn't have anticipated in terms of moving guys around, or guys that leading in the spring don't end up starting in that spot come fall. So there's lots of possibilities, and I think this spring will be an example of that.
Just a follow up too. I think he has to plan in case Ashton Craig had a hiccup with his recovery. That's not expected. He's on a good trajectory right now. But if something were to happen, is Joe Otting your guy, or
Right.
do you want to have somebody else ready for that spot?
All right, next question is from @MikeDevoy1. Last year, the extended quarterback competition in the fall was blamed, at least in part, for the poor defensive play in the first 2.5 games. Does the wide open competition for quarterback 2 threaten to impact the team in spring practice when the offense needs to be figuring out the running back and wide receiver rotations, and the new defensive line coach needs to be figuring out who and how he wants to be playing on the defensive line? Has Marcus Freeman talked about what they learned from last year's focus on the quarterback battle?
I'm going to break this up into parts here. I would say, Mike, you know your football and everything. You lost me on the quarterback competition affecting the defense. I didn't blame the quarterback competition for the defense, and this is the first I've heard of it. For me, Marcus is prioritized, as he should, exposing flaws in the spring and in August instead of having them exposed to the extent they were in September by somebody else. I mean, that's a big thing for him. But I had not connected the dots between the quarterback competition and the defense not playing well out of the chute. And then I'll answer the rest of this. What are your thoughts about that part of it, Tyler?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that I necessarily fully buy that. I think the concept is that, well, maybe you thought your defense was better because the quarterbacks were struggling a bit and sorting things out, and maybe you weren't. The CJ Carr that we saw against Miami maybe wasn't the CJ Carr you saw in practices. And so the defense was playing well. I mean, if you take, for instance, like the first practice that we saw in fall camp, like CJ Carr was really struggling, and so was Kenny Minchie. They were throwing interceptions, and the defense looked great. And obviously, that's not what the defense looked like coming out of the gate. I don't know that I would fault the quarterbacks for that, but I think that's probably where that line of thinking is coming from.
Yeah, I'm not going to buy into that. I think Marcus can do a better job of doing that. Even if they had said CJ's our quarterback going into fall camp and they didn't mess around with Minchie, I don't know that CJ would have progressed to the point where he was giving them unbelievable looks in practice. So I don't connect the dots there. In terms of, let's talk about the defensive line coach, Charlie Partridge, and getting the right people on the field. And I think that's going to help the defense be better early. You get the right personnel. You don't want to be figuring that out in September. So I think spring is the time for him to figure that out. And they also want to get to the point, I know this, that they want to be able to get pressure with their front four more often than they did, let's say, last year with their linebackers and blitzing a safety here or there. They want that front four pressure. They want to do a lot of the things that Miami did. You know, do they have the personnel? We're going to find that out. I mean, there's some really good pieces there. Boubacar Traore needs to make another step forward. Keon Keeley and Bryce Young need to be kind of pushing toward their ceiling. Those interior guys look pretty good. But I think all those things in the spring are going to help. I think if Charlie Partridge knew right now who is starters in rotation, I don't know that necessarily helps them. But in August, yes, you're going to have better ways of self-scouting and testing different concepts and so forth to make sure that you are. But I felt like the defense getting to a slow start last year was guys just not understanding their assignments, guys not understanding the concepts maybe, and maybe not buying into a new way of playing defense in the front seven that they had so much love the way Al Golden taught it and played it. But once they bought in, boy, they were pretty good at it.
Yeah, I want to make sure this question has a lot of different layers to it. So the part about the wide open competition for quarterback too threatening to impact the team as it relates to the running back and wide receiver rotations, I don't think it would impact them greatly. Particularly with more so with running back, like there's a lot of things a running back can do that has nothing to do with the second quarterback. And I think both running backs and wide receivers are going to be graded on doing the right thing. If even if the throw doesn't get to them, like there are plenty of things that you can do as a running back or receiver to establish yourself, even if maybe you don't end the play with the catch based on the decision that the quarterback made. So I think that's what those guys will be graded on and evaluated on. Obviously, you want them to be making plays too, and that could be limited if a second quarterback is struggling. But I think there are ways to sort of figure that out and sort through that, even if your second quarterback is inexperienced.
Yeah, and Mike, I'm not picking on you. I just don't know where you heard that theory, if it was from somebody who's living in his mom's basement and doing this as a hobby. But I do think Marcus feels like he made the right decision in terms of how the quarterback competition presented itself. I think that was right. Where they didn't do a good job was vetting all the flaws in their schemes and so forth before they played two really tough opponents. And he has addressed that. He said, we're going to have tough opponents in general in August and September because of being an independent. So they need to be ready out of the gate.
All right. Our next question is from Marie Biafori at Biafori_Marie. Each of you get to interview one coach on offense and one coach on defense. Head coach and coordinators are excluded. And you get to interview one of the incoming players on offense and defense. Who would you interview and what would be your first question?
Well, the really good part about that, Maria, is we get to interview all of them in reality. So I don't want to give the people in charge any ideas. But I see where you're going. I see where you're trying to get at. You're like, which coach and which newcomer would tell you most about the team? I think that's what you're looking for. And for me, I would go with Joe Rudolph on offense and Charlie Partridge on defense. And the reason is I think each of them have a lot of moving parts to deal with. And I think each of those position groups are going to profoundly affect the title run. So those would be the coaches. And then I'll let Tyler answer, and then we'll talk about the players.
Yeah, I would go with Joe Rudolph as well. In terms of the offensive coach, I don't know what his answer would be, but I'd be curious to say, okay, what's your starting five right now? I'm not sure how transparent he would be with the answer to that, but that's the question that we all want to know about. As for defense, I would like to talk to Aaron Henry. I didn't get a chance to do that the other day when he was available. My
He's
first
a big
question
blocker too.
Yeah, I did go over there towards the end, not planning to ask the question because I got there at the end. I didn't want to ask something that had already been asked. And there were no questions asked at the time that I stood there. He was talking the whole time, answering a question that was previously asked. So, but my question would be sort of how, and I don't know if he was asked something similar about how does he embrace the challenge of replacing Mike Mickens. I think that is something I'm interested in.
Yeah, it's funny the difference between those two. Mike Mickens, I don't want to say it was like a root canal, but maybe getting your teeth cleaned with real sandy tooth polish. And Aaron Henry, he's all for the interviews, man. He'd still be there talking to us if it were up to him. As far as players, I mean, we did get to pick who we talked to. For me, I spent a lot of time when it was with the freshmen. I spent time with Devin Fitzgerald, Jaden Finley, and Preston Frizzell. I had Grubbs on my list as somebody that I thought I might want to talk to. And then when you throw in the portal guys on top of it, Quincy Porter was the guy that I spent a lot of time with on offense. And for the reason why I would pick Porter out of all those guys, and I can tell you why I wanted to speak to Fitzgerald, but for Porter, I really wanted to find out what motivates him. What's his attitude like? Because he certainly has talent. Why does he want to be great? How does he think he's going to get there? I think that's really important because there's a lot of guys that are 5-star guys that flame out that don't have the right attitude. I liked what Porter brings to the table with that. And then for a defensive guy, Tyler had that interview, and it was Keon Keeley. And I wanted to see if he was defensive or if he owned his missteps along the way. And he owned all of them. And I was blown away with his attitude. And then just what his path forward looked like. I thought that was the best player feature that we've had this offseason.
All right. Thank you. So I guess I feel like I kind of cheated with this. So I just I'm providing what I actually did. The offensive newcomer that I spoke to was Noah Grubbs. The first question. Now, I think it's important to these aren't one-on-one interviews, so you might not have the first question, or you might want to let some people fill it out. So the first question that I asked Noah Grubbs was, what's the difference between Notre Dame's playbook and his high school playbook, and what's the challenge of that? And he talked about it's not just about knowing what you're doing as it relates to the Notre Dame play, but figuring out when you're not in a good look against to run that play and checking out of it. As for defensive newcomer, like Eric said, I spoke to Keon Keeley. The first question that I asked him was what was the key for him to elevate his play to a higher level than what he did at Alabama. And then got to speak to him for extended amount of time. I was surprised that there were so few people talking to him when I was speaking to him. And I think that was in part because Charlie Partridge was in the room, so everyone wanted to talk to him. And I was like, you know what, I'm going to stay committed to Keon Keeley and see this through the end. And yeah, I probably spoke to him for upwards of 15 minutes, and not alone, but there was more than 3 of us speaking to him at once. So that was a great opportunity, and he was great in terms of how he answered the questions and the way he was being thoughtful about the answers he was saying.
Yeah, and sometimes, I mean, you kind of try to read the player in terms of, and some of it is how many questions are you going to get? And so, I mean, a lot of time, hey, how you doing?
Usually, my strategy is never to do my best question first. You want to establish a rapport with them first to get them comfortable and maybe for them to get to know you a little bit somehow when you're asking the question, or your understanding of them, trying to display that in the first question that you asked.
Right. A perfect example of that was when Jason Anye did his first interview since coming back from the mental health thing. There were some really important questions, but to hit those right out of the gate would have, I think, put him ill at ease. I think he needed to kind of work up to that.
All right. Our next question is from Jack Quinn at JQ6008. Will the future home and homes with Alabama and Texas and down the line IU, Florida, and Michigan actually get played? And if hypothetically Notre Dame could leave the ACC free and clear, is there any incentive for on the SEC/Big Ten's part for a similar agreement? And then in parentheses, he said Big East for other sports.
Okay, so let's take these in 2 chunks. The first chunk is the scheduling part. I let off my live chat transcript with that yesterday. Marie actually asked a similar question to this in the live chat. I don't think this is a Notre Dame specific issue, although it does affect Notre Dame. I think this is a college football issue right now, in that in 2024 in the playoff, it felt like those kind of games were incentivized for teams to play those. In the 2025 playoff, not so much. Indiana was clearly the best team in college football, and yet, they got the number 1 seed despite playing Indiana State, Kennesaw State, and Old Dominion. And Texas Tech was similarly rewarded. They were given a bye, and they played Oregon State, Arkansas Pine Bluff, and Kent State. So if you're going to get a bye by playing that kind of competition and then just playing your conference schedule, and I think Texas Tech had maybe the harder overall part of its conference, yet the Big Ten was a much better conference. and Indiana played enough good teams this year to show people who they were. I just think unless it's really emphasized, unless there's a lot of language from both college football leaders and the college football playoff selection committee, you may see some of those series go bye-bye because Texas felt like playing Ohio State kept it from getting into the playoff. If they had had 2 losses instead of 3, they would have been in. To me, that loss to Ohio State was one of their better resume markers. I actually valued that on Texas's resume. What I didn't value was losing to Florida, getting crushed by Georgia, playing with its food, as one of my favorite ESPN guys likes to say, but against Mississippi State and Kentucky, winning those games in overtime. When you look at their overall resume, they had the Texas A&M one, which was really good, but they didn't have a lot of other things. And again, I thought the Ohio State loss but they felt like 3 losses that knocked them out of it. Why not play Ohio instead of Ohio State? By the same token, if Notre Dame and Miami don't play and Miami doesn't win that game and play Notre Dame, if they played Old Dominion, I don't think Miami makes the playoff. So, because they were a 10 seed, they were the last at-large team in. So I think there needs to be a lot of discussion about that and a lot of incentivizing playing this difficult competition, or else there aren't a lot of great reasons to do those.
Yeah, and I'm just for starters, the playoff format itself has to be finalized as we move forward to when these games are actually going to be played to inform what the strategy is for these schools and how they do that. I think it's certainly impossible to know or predict how many of those games would be played. I wouldn't bet on Notre Dame going 5 for 5 on those in terms of all those staying on the schedule, but I don't necessarily know which of those right now are more or less likely. I think there's just too much uncertainty in terms of the playoff format and what is being valued by both the playoff itself and the schools themselves in terms of, okay, is it still, maybe this isn't, maybe if you believe it's better to play cupcakes than to bring in Notre Dame for your non-conference schedule if you're these Power 4 teams. But is it worth the money to bring in Notre Dame and play against Notre Dame? What is the balance there that you're weighing? And I think every school is probably going to come to its own decision as it relates to that.
And then the second part was if hypothetically ND could leave the ACC free and clear, is there any incentive for the SEC, Big Ten for a similar agreement, Big East and other sports? I'll leave the Big East and other sports out of it. For me, it's a great brand and expands the footprint, especially of the ACC, but the Big Ten too, when you think about Notre Dame being a national team and not an Indiana team, I think it would add money and value to their football media rights package. So I do think there could be conversations. I think the SEC would be much more amenable to this than the Big Ten, given who the commissioners are of those 2 leagues right now. But I do think that's something that Pete Nakos should be exploring. If legally they can get out of the ACC, that needs to be step 1. And then step 2, is there a better fit? Because the ACC Notre Dame joined in 2014 isn't the ACC of 2026.
Yeah, I also think that's partially why the ACC is so desperate to have Notre Dame in there. I don't know that the SEC or the Big Ten would be as desperate for that, for 2 or 3 Notre Dame road games per year. That's the biggest money part of that when you talk about being able to, those conferences being able to negotiate their TV rights and gaining revenue there.
And their bowl package was improved because
sure. I'm not sure, like, if the SEC or Big Ten were to agree with that, why would they agree to not take on the other sports? Like, why would you send the rest of your sports to the Big East and not to the SEC or Big Ten? I don't think that makes a lot of sense. I almost think Notre Dame's at a disadvantage in basketball if it goes to the Big East when you're dealing with programs that or schools that and athletic departments that are more interested in their basketball programs being good than some of them don't even have football programs. So I don't know that would be beneficial for it. Obviously, there's more than just the basketball programs you're weighing, but the basketball programs are probably the ones that you're the most likely to make money with as it relates to the college sports landscape. So I don't like the idea of putting your other sports in the Big East, but we'll see what happens. I would imagine there will be some discussions about what it looks like moving forward for Notre Dame, and obviously the biggest thing is the deal with the ACC and the cost of getting out of it. All right, our last series of questions come from TVP on the loose emoji board. I'll fire them all off here, and then we'll go back through them. Number one, able to share when spring practice starts, able to share when Coach Freeman will next meet with the media, able to share when team medical personnel will meet with the media to give updates on player injuries, and lastly, care to take a crack on the 22 projected starters after the spring game.
Okay, let's do the dates and then do the starters. Able to share when spring practice starts? Yes, March 20th. We can't share some specifics about spring practice, and we can't share the whole schedule, but we can share the start is going to be March 20th. Able to share when Coach Freeman will next meet with the media, March 18th, 2 days before we kick it off with the first spring practice. And then let's see, able to share when the medical personnel meet with the media to give updates on injuries. Not going to give you a specific date, but it'll be before spring practice starts, and we will have that opportunity. And then you and I can do the 22. Why don't we do offense first and then defense? Does that sound good?
Sounds good to me.
Okay. I don't think the starters post-spring are necessarily going to be the starters on September 6th. So let me do the latter. These are the guys that I think will line up against Wisconsin and Green Bay. So I'll start with quarterback, CJ Carr, running back, Aeneas Williams. I'm going to go with 4 receivers because I think they're all going to play a lot. And that's Quincy Porter, Jordan Faison, Jaden Greathouse, and Mylan Graham. James Flanagan is my starting tight end. My starting right tackle, Gerby Lambert. Starting right guard in a surprise move, Anthony Knapp. Center, Ashton Craig. Left guard, Will Black. Left tackle, Charles Jagaza.
All right. We have the skill positions the same as at least through the receivers, although I didn't cheat and put 4 receivers on the field. I went I went with Porter, Greathouse, and Faison. At tight end, I have Cooper Flanagan. And then my offensive line is left tackle Anthony Knapp, left guard Sullivan Absher, center Ashton Craig, right guard Charles Jagaza, and right tackle Gerby Lambert.
Sounds good.
All right. How about your defense?
Then defense, Eric? My defensive line, Boubacar Traore, Jason Onye, Francis Brew, Keeley or Bryce Young. I think that's going to be a tag team. If I had to say who's going to go running out there first, I'm going to go with Keeley. My linebackers, I'm going to go with Drake Bowen and Jalen Sneed. It's going to be really interesting with a new linebackers coach, how he views that rotation. I didn't put Kingston Viliamu Asa because I'm not sure that he's going to be heavy repping in August and September. I think he's going to be coming back right about that time. So that's why I would put Sneed in there. And he didn't start much last year anyways. It was usually Sneed and Bowen. But if KVA is healthy, then he's a starter. And then my secondary, I have the safeties, Adon Schuler and Tay Johnson. My boundary corner is Leonard Moore. My field corner is DJ McKinney, and my nickel is Christian Gray.
All right, we're pretty much similar on the defense. I did not put Gray at nickel. That's something I have to see to believe. I'm not ready to project that yet. So I kept Gray to the field at Dallas Golden at nickel. That leaves DJ McKinney out, who we won't see at all in the spring. So right. That situation will be still being played out after the spring. So we'll learn how that goes. But yeah, everything else I think I agree with. I did put Bryce Young ahead of Keon Keeley, but the starter who's the starter there is less important because they'll probably both play a lot. And yeah, the KVA and Jalen Sneed dilemma with linebacker in terms of who's healthy. If KVA is healthy, I think he's certainly the starter because he's arguably one of the best players on the defense.
Yeah. And again, that's what spring is for. I mean, sometimes these experiments work, sometimes they don't. Chris Stewart flipped over to nose guard one spring. They're like, this isn't working. Back to offensive line. He ends up being a kick-ass offensive lineman. What was the wide receiver that was the safety, the kid that ended up playing for Seattle, the running back in 2015 ahead of Adams? His name is escaping.
CJ Procise.
CJ Procise. That was just a hey, let's take a flyer on this kid. Ends up being 1,000-yard rusher and an NFL draft pick at running back. So sometimes they hit, sometimes they don't. So.
All right, that is it for this week's episode of the Third and Gold podcast. We've been gone for a while, but hopefully trying to get here at least every other week. And as we get into spring football, we'll have much more to talk about, of course. So you can plan to hear from us more in March and April. You can find us on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify, and other podcast homes. Search for Notre Dame Football with Eric Hansen and Tyler James if you're not already subscribed to us on the proper feeds. And we have much more written content over at blueandgold.com. So stick with Blue and Gold for all your Notre Dame coverage needs.